I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the World Economic Forum to this morning's breakfast. It goes without saying that our two panelists need no introduction, and I'm not going to waste a second on doing that. You wouldn't be here otherwise. And in fact, I want to dive right in. I'm going to start with a very selfish question. I told Alan Bono beforehand, and that's to ask each of them to begin with an update on their own respective agendas and passions. I'm going to ask Al to give us an update on the climate issue. Where are we really as a baseline for this discussion? Are we actually making progress post-Bali? Are we treading water? Are we going backwards, actually, in real terms? And Bono, I'd like you to do the same, if you would, on the poverty agenda. Al, you want to start?
Yes, we could take the whole session talking just about the new scientific evidence of the last few weeks and months showing that the climate crisis is significantly worse and unfolding more rapidly than those on the pessimistic side of the IPCC projections had warned us. Perhaps most dramatically, one of the new comprehensive studies and computer models of the North Polar ice cap now shows that it could be completely and totally gone during summer months in as little as 5 years. The consequences of a disappearance that's not quickly followed by all-out planetary efforts to try to bring about a recovery as quickly as possible are just almost impossible to describe. There are many other indicators, but where the political efforts to bring about an effective consensus worldwide are concerned, we saw a little bit of progress in the meeting in Bali and in December, but it's important to recognize what that progress represented and what it was missing. It had a big, large blank spot in the design of the treaty, or the roadmap, as they called it, which basically said this missing spot is where the policy of the United States of America should be. And we recognize, we the delegates to this global enterprise recognize that the United States is in a process of change. Regardless of which political party is victorious, there will be a new president elected November of this year. And when the next negotiating session takes place in Poznan, Poland, in December of this calendar year, there will be two delegations. There will be the one representing officially the United States, and then there will be the group of people invited to present the views of the incoming president, who will be inaugurated in January of 2009. Then at the end of 2009 in Copenhagen, this global treaty is to be completed. But everybody should be clear, in response to your question, Tom, this is a planetary emergency. There has never been anything remotely like it in the entire history of human civilization. We are putting at risk all of human civilization. It is difficult to summon the moral imagination necessary to understand the degree of responsibility that is on the shoulders of those of us who are alive in this day and time. All future generations will at some point look back and make an assessment of whether we succeeded or failed. And the formula for success has to include the marriage of the struggle against extreme poverty and disease and the historic challenge that Bono has been so effective in helping to lead, to lift the poorest of the poor out of their poverty. I hope during this session we can talk about why it is so crucial for those two agendas to be married and brought together. Bono and I have been talking about it for quite some time. I called him last October, and since then we've had numerous meetings and extensive discussions about it. I think it's one of the keys to creating a global compact that will actually help us answer your question when it comes at some point in the future. How are we doing? With a resounding, we've turned the corner, we're solving this, and that's the good news. We don't have the good news yet, but we have the basis for writing it in the future.
Terrific. Bono, give us your update on the poverty side of the agenda.
Okay. First thing, if anyone sees my band, would you please not tell them that I was up this early? It's really not very rock and roll. And just to Tom, I'll get on to Al in a minute. I would very happily change places and be interviewing Tom Friedman. I think he's the most extraordinary commentator. I'm very honoured to have him ask us questions.
Thank you.
On issues of extreme poverty, and I would have to say something extraordinary at the outset, which maybe not enough people have heard, which is the good news about debt cancellation. When I first came to Davos, we were talking about debt cancellation, and new figures from the World Bank, OECD confirmed, are that there are now 29 million extra children going to school on the continent of Africa as a result of debt cancellation. And that is pretty extraordinary. Now, this is largely due to great leadership in Africa, as it happens. Their choice to redirect funds that were servicing interest on these old payments. But it just shows you what is possible when you get out there, when you get on the streets, when you make your case in arenas like this, so that's something. The other thing I came to Davos about some years ago was to talk about the AIDS emergency, and indeed we launched RED, which was the sort of commercial wing of trying to get antiretroviral drugs for Africans. Well, we were laughed at wandering around the corridors in Capitol Hill. In fact, the head of USAID, I think at the time, was quoted as saying, "Africans don't have wristwatches. How on earth will we get these complicated drug regimens into the furthest corners of Africa?" Well, it turns out African adherence to their drug regimens is better than either Europeans or Americans. And it turns out that a conservative administration in the United States, with support on both sides of the Hill, went off on the AIDS emergency, and there are now 2 million Africans on antiretroviral drugs, and that is pretty astonishing. And I want to so 46 million bed nets, great. It's a great start. The actual measure of where we're going, though, is how we're doing in trajectory on the commitments made to the Millennium Development Goals, and in 2005 when the G8 met in Glen Eagles in Scotland and promised a $50 billion increase by 2010 annually to help developing worlds, to partner with the developing world to get them out of off the bottom rung. Well, that's not so good. And it's strange because the good news makes the bad news even worse. We've proved that aid can be effective when it's given, as it is in debt cancellation, to countries that are tackling corruption and not to despots to redecorate their presidential palaces. We've proved that aid is effective, and yet the G8 are not making good largely on their commitments. About half, I would say, is where we've got. And so the Millennium Development Goals look like they're not going to happen, and the G8 commitments made in 2005 look like they will not come off. And this is a scandal. And it actually it makes the kind of dialogue that social movements have been having with government look look preposterous, and it looks like we were led a dance. We went to, met with Angela Merkel. Germany's not on their trajectory, but she has promised she will put that right. And that is courageous when you think that in Germany they have a 4% GDP committed to the reunification project. I met with President Sarkozy last week, or the week before, and I told him that, all the big ideas that we're talking about, the climate crisis and various geopolitical strife, if you can't keep these commitments to the poorest of the poor, who are we? It's an issue of credibility, not just France or Europe's, but actually President Sarkozy himself. And he said, this is very hard for us at this time. He said, I made a promise to the French people to make their lives better. He said, this is not going to be easy for us in France. But I commit to you that we will get to the work and we will keep our promise. So there are some encouraging signs, at least verbally. And I was very impressed by his energy, actually, and his knowledge of the subject. So there's the good news and the bad news.
Terrific. Before we go on, I just also was asked to make an announcement at 9:30 this morning at the Sun Star Hotel. We'll be continuing this dialogue with Larry Page and Sergey Brin of Google and Larry Brilliant of Google.org. It's open to the public for anyone who wants to come, and there'll be a conversation on these issues of energy poverty and climate. It's at the Sun Star Hotel at 9:30. Al, tell us about the meeting you and Bono had. How did it come about? To what extent did you determine that the issue of climate and poverty, these two agendas, have been fighting each other? To what extent have they in the real world? And what did you conclude is the way to get them to work together?
Well, I don't think they've really been fighting. There may have been a wordless competition for the title of biggest disappointing failure. The commitments on the MDGs, as Bono said, have not been met, and the moral commitment that this generation should make to all of the future generations has not even begun to be met.
Tell us a little about that meeting, though. You called Bono, you just called him up out of the blue and said, hey, let's get together?
Yeah, well, we've known each other for some time, and we actually first talked about these issues here at Davos about 4 or 5 years ago. And back in early October, I called, and we ended up talking for about an hour on the telephone. Then we talked again in Dublin. We talked again. We had a day-long working session last week as part of this, and then a working dinner, altogether probably about 8 intensive hours. And we were joined by development specialists and climate scientists. Look, first of all, the Millennium Development Goals can be met only if the unfolding climate crisis is taken into the fabric of that discussion and those commitments. There are maps of the poorest countries that show very clearly how specific plans for creating sustainable agriculture and creating employment opportunities and lifting people out of poverty will work, but with a 2-degree C increase in temperatures, those same plans will fail. So taking the increases in temperature already built into the changes that we've made, all this pollution in the atmosphere, all the greenhouse pollution trapping more heat, that has to be taken into account. Secondly, in an IT-empowered outsourcing world, it is unimaginable that the wealthy, industrialized, developed nations would enter into an agreement that has no provisions for to anticipate the moving of production facilities that might at the margins face a brand new set of economics because of carbon constraints into countries that do not have any carbon constraints. It is with a global compact, the world can solve the climate crisis. With a global compact, the world can solve the extreme poverty crisis. But in order to reach a global compact, all nations have to be a part of it. And the G77 are sometimes misunderstood as having no influence and power in the world. In fact, when you get into a global negotiation that requires agreement by all nations, they have a lot of political power to veto an agreement. If there is in the fabric of the agreement a contractual agreement, a treaty obligation to meet these development goals in ways that also assist the sharp reduction in CO2 emissions, then it becomes not a G8 public promise, but a contract. The G8 does not have pooled sovereignty. The G8 is not a governmental body. It is a place where 8 countries talk to one another. And if in their talking they say, we will do this, there is nothing to keep them to that other than moral pressure, which is quite considerable. But if at the same time there is a truly global agreement that is aimed at ensuring human survival, and the agreement makes it clear that we are all in this together. And incidentally, the single most powerful reminder that we are all in it together is the one thing that we share, the planet. And the thin shell of atmosphere surrounding the planet is what the scientists call a fully mixed system. CO2 molecules that go into the atmosphere in Detroit or in Nairobi quickly circle the globe, and the concentrations are spread everywhere. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere." In our world, CO2 increases anywhere threaten the future of human civilization everywhere. We need to plant trees. We need to create jobs building solar-powered Wi-Fi nodes, and you pick your own examples. We need to transfer technology. We need to assist the poorest nations to leapfrog the old, dirty technologies that were used 150 years ago in the West. And we need to have a binding agreement that is arrived at in December of 2009 that marries these two agendas.
Bono, from your perspective, have you felt that the climate and the poverty issues, not that they should, but have in fact fought one another, and that one has overshadowed the other? And just to follow that up, why shouldn't they? Why can these two work together?
Well, I must admit, I have to be a little honest about this, that it has, you know, we have noticed that that the interest from the media, which has been so acute on issues of extreme poverty, is not as acute now recently, with climate crisis felt much more at home. We're talking about people who live a long way from us. And if you said that as a result of the Earth heating up, 10 million children were going to die next year, well, you'd read about little else in the newspapers. Well, they are. They're going to die next year from extreme poverty, from preventable disease, waterborne illness, stuff like that. So there was a little bit of unsettledness. Now there's the other thing, which is when approaching the climate crisis, when you've got a blue suede shoes with a large carbon footprint, like a rock and roll band does. Now, Al Gore's an extraordinary man, and he doesn't confuse zealotry for commitment. And I've noticed that, and I kind of relaxed a little bit about that. And he's been around my house, and I'm a little bit, here's the recycler, ow. I got a posh car, but, it runs on ethanol, ow. And, there's a little bit of that.
Your kids had already pointed those things out.
Well, my wife, it's like living with Al Gore anyway, so sleeping with Al Gore.
There's your headline. That's
right. But he has, it's not even a professorial thing as has been cited. He's more sort of rabbinical, or like an Irish priest. You meet him in the supermarket, you start to, you confess your sins and stuff. And it's like, Father Al, I am not just a noise polluter. I am a noise polluting, diesel sucking, methane emitting, Gulf Stream flying rock star. And what are you going to do about it, son? Are you going to kick the habit? I say, I'm trying, Father Al, but to be honest with you, oil has been very good for me. It's been very good for me. It's been very good to me. Those convoys of articulated lorries and, petrochemical products, hair gel. There's that little bit of and then I suppose as you dig deeper and you start to understand that, going cold turkey on carbon emissions is actually a little dangerous. And we've just seen with the stock market, the prosperity that we're enjoying is more precarious than we might think. And I like the idea, that's a horrible thing to say. What I meant was a climate crisis is kind of where I'm at. And I kind of believe in innovation to be able to move away slowly. If this is a bomb, then we dispose of it, very careful management of the bomb disposal. And because I remember unemployment in Ireland in the 70s, and I just think you've got to be very careful about this. Al describes it as an emergency. And if he's right, I might have to rethink some of the way we live. But I don't want to yet. And an example of this would be, the airline industry. And because some of the zealots say, that's it, we're not going anywhere. We're going to stay where we are. And now the airline industry, as well as, offering us, help with business and our vacations, for the developing world, particularly landlocked countries, is critical. Not just for tourism, which is an important part of Africa's economic life, but trade. So things like that, so have made me a little nervous. But Al is right when he called and he said, that the brunt of this this climate crisis is going to be felt in the developing world. And all your work, and people like you, who've done more work than I, will be undone if you don't focus on this.
Let me ask you just a specific
Could I respond to one thing there? I think it's really important where the climate crisis is concerned to try, for all of us, to try to move away from the idea that personal actions by each of us represents the solution to this crisis. They're important, and making changes of those sorts can also build the political consensus, and they do add up. But in addition to changing the light bulbs, it is far more important to change the laws and to change the treaty obligations that nations have. The one simple thing that will solve the climate crisis is to put a price on carbon. Presently, whether it's airline transportation or the choice of a vehicle or a businessman's choice on what kind of factory to build and how to power it, all of those choices are going to continue to be made. And the notion that we're going to appeal to their consciences to please do it this way or please do it that way, okay, that plays a role, but that's not my approach. I think we need to set a price on carbon. It needs to be effected globally so that those who don't pay the price for carbon don't have an advantage over those who do. Under the present arrangement, without a binding treaty, without laws that really solve this for us, then those who voluntarily try to help solve this can be in a situation where they're at a disadvantage, and that's not sustainable as a solution. And so the poorer countries of the world, you know, when I left Kyoto in 1997, I was very happy that we got a treaty that was the beginning of this process. I went back to Washington, D.C., and utterly failed at the effort to persuade the United States Senate to ratify that treaty. And the single biggest argument against it was, well, the U.S. and the wealthy countries are in the first phase. These other countries won't be covered for quite a while, and we'll lose jobs to them. Well, there are answers to that, but those answers no longer suffice in this world. We have to have a truly global agreement, and as part of it, the G77 have to be able to get adaptation funds. There has to be a very large fund for adaptation so
Amen.
that they can deal with the devastating consequences. They rely more on subsistence agriculture. They don't have fully developed public health systems to deal with the disease consequences of global warming. They do not have the ability to put up the barriers against rising seas or to recover quickly from the more intense storms, from the droughts, and from the flooding. Look, I mean, just in the last few months, 18 countries in Africa have had record of flooding, and they've always had floods, but everywhere in the world, these floods and the droughts are getting more intense and more sustained. And the poor countries are the ones least able to deal with it. By giving them the help that we should be giving them anyway, it should be made a part of this global compact by which the wealthier countries also agree to make the rapid, speedy, historic transition to a low-carbon economy.
A quick follow on that. My own mantra has been, it's much more important to change your leaders than your light bulbs. And we're now about to change leaders in the United States. As you look at that, I'm not going to ask you to endorse anybody in one way or another. I know you haven't. But, I mean, do you look at this election as saying, well, anything is going to be better than Bush, okay, on this issue? Or is that an illusion, okay, that sort of the assumption the Democrats are going to win here? And so I have two questions. One is, should we assume that any Democrat will be fine, they will do the right thing in terms of a price on carbon? And does the current economic crisis in the world right now really work against that? At a time when the government's be pushing money out now in the public, the idea that we would ask for a tax or cap and trade or whatever on carbon, is this current economic crisis coming at exactly the wrong time?
Well, first of all, when you invite me to compare all of the candidates to the current administration, I must begin with a disclaimer. I've recently begun to fear that I'm losing my objectivity on Bush and Cheney. and as a result, you should take what I say there with a grain of salt. By the way, everybody should go see U2 3D. This new movie is absolutely spectacular. Back to the commercials.
Thanks, Sal. What was that one you were in?
I think that all three of the Democratic candidates have responsible positions. They don't go far enough. John McCain on the Republican side has a responsible position that doesn't go far enough. Governor Huckabee comes at it from a different direction, and the historic movement within the evangelical tradition toward creation care and toward a recognition of why this has to be a part of their agenda is responsible for Governor Huckabee's position. And so I look at all that, and I think that whoever is elected is going to have a different position and a better position. But let's be clear, whoever the leaders are, this issue is going to be dealt with responsibly and effectively when there is a sufficient degree of urgency on the part of the people themselves. No change affecting the price of carbon will be tolerated in a political system until the people ask for it. Now, it actually is an opportunity to address the slow growth, or if there is a recession, as so many believe is in the works now, as a strategy for stimulating sustainable growth. We can put a price on carbon and recycle the revenue through the economy in a revenue-neutral way. The fact that oil has gone above $100 a barrel, the fact that the proven reserves are not being increased at anything like the rate of the increasing demand for petroleum worldwide, particularly with China and India and others now joining in the search for recoverable supplies, means that, well, look, the United States has a security crisis because the largest pool of proven reserves is in the most unstable area of the world. Our balance of payments deficit affects the decline of the dollar. The single largest part of that balance of payments deficit is all the money that we spend for foreign oil. We can create good, sustainable jobs by moving more quickly toward renewable energy sources. And by the way, the increased price of petroleum also has more devastating consequences in the poorest nations than any other place. And so going toward advanced solar thermal power plants. Europe is now looking at a so-called supergrid design. And governments shouldn't pick the winners, but having a grid that can connect Africa to Europe and then let the market decide whether advanced solar thermal plants or cellulosic ethanol technologies, or the new advanced geothermal technologies, or large wind and small wind operations, and the others that are now coming along, advanced photovoltaics. These technologies are now competitive. And the notion that Google has put forward of renewable energy should be at a cost equal to or less than coal, that equation works quicker and better when the price of coal is adjusted to reflect its true price. The fact that burning it without capturing the carbon destroys the habitability of the planet for human beings should be included in the price.
Bono, in your own travels, have you noticed this correlation between climate-deprived areas, climate-ravaged areas, poverty, and geopolitical hotspots? Governments that don't work or are in civil war. Do these three, have they solely started to overlap on your own map as you travel? And if so, why do you think that's the case?
Okay, before I answer that, just on the presidential race,
yeah.
Whoever takes office in November, or wins the election in November rather, is at a very, very unique moment in time in history. And these are dangerous times we live in, but they have this great opportunity in the crisis and the crises that we face. But it is a critical moment, and I sense that what we're looking for is coherence across three surfaces, the three extremes. Extreme poverty, extreme climate change, also extreme ideologies, which we haven't really talked about, but what you're hinting at. And somehow to weave these three strands into coherent foreign policy will be the job of the next President of the United States. It's the job of every leader. And at this point in time, now...
Do you think any of the leading candidates... You can talk about this a little bit.
Yeah.
Does one seem to have more coherence than the other on that?
Ask me another one. What I will tell you is none of them, I kind of going to back up what Al says, none of them will be able to make the necessary jump away from incrementalism, which is what we've been dealing with up to now, to any kind of dramatic response. Now, there have been moments in time when the world has been reimagined and the interdependence has been reimagined. This is one of those, and you're at it here today. The project of globalization, which has benefited a lot of us, has brought some people out of poverty, a lot of people out of poverty. But we're now wondering, is it going to work for the many rather than the few? Is it enough to rise to this occasion? These three extremes. And normally when the world is being reimagined and there's a new order, that's a loaded thing to say around here, but it comes after a catastrophe, not before. You know, after the First World War, you had the League of Nations. After the Second World War, you had the Bretton Woods institutions, the UN. This is one of those times. But I suppose we're asking people to imagine it before a catastrophe. You can call 9/11 a catastrophe. That was a catastrophe, but on global terms it was not, like the First World War, the Second World War. So I just want to say that.
Sure.
You want to comment?
Yeah, I did want to comment. I wanted to compliment Bono and those he's organized in the One campaign for getting the presidential candidates in the U.S. on record with respect to the agenda that Bono is pursuing. And he, by the way, is one of the best politicians I've ever run into. You may not like
I'll take that as an insult.
Yeah.
Except for your good self, of course.
As Groucho Marx once said, I resemble that remark. And Tom, I want to join Bono in complimenting you for your leadership on this issue and many others. But the role of the media is really important. One of the environmental groups in the United States just completed 2 weeks ago a very careful and painstaking analysis of every single question asked by the American television networks to all of the candidates for president, Democratic and Republican. There were in calendar year 2007, the total was 2,976 questions. How many of them were about the climate crisis? The answer is 3. The same number that were asked of them about UFOs. Now, if in the media environment in which this campaign takes place, the media completely and totally ignores the climate crisis in the campaign dialogue in favor of horse race questions and these other matters, then it's no wonder that the candidates don't feel challenged by it. Second point that I wanted to make on the issue of big changes coming often in the aftermath of a disaster. If you look around the world today, you will see a lot of disasters that the scientists tell us are best understood as being far more likely in a world that has the kind of greenhouse gas concentrations that we have. 2 months ago, 500,000 people were driven from their homes in California by fires. A month earlier, there was a national emergency in Greece that almost brought down the government of Greece because of the fires. The historic flooding in much of the middle of Africa.
Mozambique.
What's happening in Mozambique. There are people who are having to make plans to leave the places they've long called home in the frozen far north and in the low-lying Pacific Islands. New Orleans was a disaster, and it has still not recovered. And there are, unfortunately, many similar examples. Connecting the dots is what the IPCC does. And 4 times now, They have told the world, practically screaming from the rooftops now, this is a catastrophe. It is unfolding. If we do not act, it will be unimaginably worse, to the point where it will threaten the enterprise of human civilization. But it is also an opportunity for us to reimagine ourselves as a planetary civilization, to see ourselves as we truly are, one human species living on the one same planet with the same atmosphere, sharing the same common future. So it is no longer enough to say that the United States and other wealthy countries should generously give foreign aid or relieve debt or help countries that are suffering and in trouble. It is in our own self-interest and part of our need to ensure our survival that we bring them into this global enterprise and ask them to help us reduce carbon. We can solve this. This is solvable. We do not have much time. But in order to solve it, we really have to use our moral imagination to see what we all have in common.
Bono, when the next president, which will be a year from now, will just be taking office, if you could ask him or her to make one decision that would have an amplified effect on both climate and poverty, to start off his or her administration with one decision, what would it be?
I think not just to recommit to the Millennium Development Goals, but to show a trajectory toward them that starts in the 2009 budget. That would be good.
Mm-hmm. It can be two or three, but what would be the things? What should be their agenda? That could work for both of these things too.
But I want to stick with that first point because, as I said to President Sarkozy, there's a question of credibility, and people like myself are very suspicious of now grand occasions, grand bargains, and so we have to see it start immediately in honouring the commitments that are already there, and just on this sort of geopolitical strife. The hot spots, just to finish that out, this is going to have to happen for strategic reasons. I've had some odd things happen to me over the last years, but getting a call from a 4-star general at home on a Sunday afternoon in Dublin was pretty good, and General Jim Jones, who ran NATO, an amazing character, and he has this. He said some very moving things to me. And one of the things he said, and this is a little American-centric, so forgive me, he said, I'm a Marine. He said, men and women of the Marine Corps, courageous people. He says, they don't mind being shot at for the right reasons. They do not like being shot at for the wrong reasons. I said, what's that, General? What's the wrong reason? He said, for being American. We don't like that. And he said, we need to change the way we engage with the world. And he said, we've got billions of dollars of high-tech equipment floating in the Mediterranean Sea, off the coast of Lebanon. He says, we're losing against Hezbollah because they're building schools. He said, we need to understand more about development. He said, I have an equation that I'm taking around with me at the moment, which is stability equals security plus development. So this was starting to happen. Last week I went to see the Secretary of Defense in the United States, rock star in Pentagon. That's a trip. And he was talking about how the development budget has to be seen as much of a priority as defense. Extraordinary stuff. So there is a kind of coalition. People are getting together to understand where these add up. For him, for instance, the Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa is an example of all three issues coming together. The Sahel has had, I think, 25% less rain over 30 years. If you look at Darfur, desertification over the last 40 years in Sudan has led to 100 kilometers extra. The Sahara Desert has gone into the Sudan. Now, it's not completely clear that this is climate change, but it's certainly linked to it. You don't think about the conflict in Darfur as being related to extreme poverty or the fact that there's just nothing, to eke out a living is really difficult, rights to water, rights to your livestock grazing. This is what set people off at each other. A country like Nigeria, it's an extraordinary country, 130 million people live there. It's the whole of West Africa, an oil-rich country, a mini Iraq, if you like. And in the north of that country, as it meets the Sahel, you have Sharia law. Every village, if we don't educate people and help with education, I think you'll find that there'll be others who might be educating people against us.
Apropos of that, let me just ask to frame a question here. Your point about the questions to candidates, I think, is a very important one, and it raises two questions in my mind, which is, are we part of a conversation, a global conversation? Because it's global, it seems really big, but in fact, it's the same 100,000 people talking to each other.
The same 500.
Or 500 maybe, and we haven't actually broken through. I mean, that's one question. And the other question is that maybe because I totally agree with you. We need to set a price on carbon. But when you think about that in the history of the environmental movements historically have been about getting government to kind of stop things rather than to do things. And this would actually have to be the first mass movement that actually called for a tax. That's not an easy thing to or a swap, but it's not an easy thing to make. But talk about both of these, because it seems to me that we've got a lot of peak load protests going on, but not a lot of base load protests. Always on.
Yeah. Well, first of all, 17 years ago, before I was vice president, I wrote a book called Earth in the Balance, and in part of that, I traced what the scientists were then saying about the Sahel. And the shift and where the rain falls and where the deserts grow was already advanced. And there, as Ban Ki-moon pointed out in a speech in the United Nations recently, although the human and political factors that have created the tragedy of Darfur are dominant, actually the underlying reality is connected to the climate crisis. In that book, I called for a global Marshall Plan. We always draw on metaphors from the past, whether it's the Apollo program or the Manhattan program or the Marshall Plan. We do need a global Marshall Plan. And looking at this in the security context, back in those years and before, I used to work on nuclear arms control. And I learned from the military historians that conflicts are usually put into three categories: local battles, regional or theater wars, and the rare but all-important global or strategic conflict. And each level of conflict requires a different way of thinking, a different massing of resources, a different logistics plan, and a different strategic outlook. The environmental problems that people are used to thinking about and talking about are mainly in the first category of local environmental problems: air pollution, water pollution, a toxic waste site. We became aware of regional problems such as acid rain, where the transport of pollutants from one region to another, from the Midwest to the Northeast in the United States, from Western Europe into the polar regions and into Scandinavia, the dead zone of the Gulf of Mexico, etc. And there are many of these. But the climate crisis is the rare but all-important strategic environmental threat. The air in this room has 6 times as many chlorine atoms in each breath we take than it did 50 years ago, because of one family of chemicals, chlorofluorocarbons. And that doesn't threaten health directly, but that's what created the hole in the stratospheric ozone layer. The world got together when the scientific community pointed out what was happening. Ronald Reagan, a conservative Republican president, Margaret Thatcher, a conservative Prime Minister of England, Tip O'Neill, a liberal Democratic Speaker of the House of Representatives, they listened to the scientists instead of trying to censor them, instead of trying to hide the scientific results. Now we have the second crisis of the global atmosphere, much, much larger than the first, and much more difficult to solve, because unlike chlorofluorocarbons, CO2 is the exhaling breath of industrial civilization. But it need not be. It's only been 150 years that we've been this reliant on coal and oil and natural gas, it used to sound hopelessly idealistic and naive to point out that more energy from the sun reaches the surface of the earth than a million times all the energy consumed by our civilization. But technology has now advanced to the point where it can be competitive as a source of energy compared to oil. It is absolutely and totally crazy for us to continue digging all the carbon out of the ground and putting it in the atmosphere. We know what it does. It's destroying the basis for civilization. Now, the environmental groups are laboring heroically to try to address this. Most all of them were formed in an earlier era and focused on earlier goals. Now they're getting responses from their donor communities to global warming, and so they're all trying to position themselves to do something about it. But they shouldn't all be reinventing the same wheel, because they should also continue the historic missions that they have. The Alliance for Climate Protection, which is the umbrella group created to launch a strategic persuasion campaign worldwide, is the group that's going to be launching in 2 months a mass persuasion campaign, first in the United States, then in a different way in China and in India. We're also training people around the world to try to get this message at the village level, at the town and city level, and to try to change public opinion. It has to come from the people themselves.
Bono, do you want to say something on that? So, question of public opinion.
Public opinion?
Right. How do you generate kind of always on public opinion so politicians who write the rules that shape the markets actually do the right thing at scale? Because it's a scale problem.
Well, in the end, it's always social movements that win the day, not, the few, and whether they be rock stars or vice presidents. It's always social movements. It was this with universal suffrage, with civil rights. It's always social movements, and people sometimes say to me, why are you always, in the ear of presidents and politicians, and why do you spend so much time with them, whispering your arguments into the ear, trying to be, to win the argument with them? The reason is because we don't have the social movement yet. We used to pretend. My job as an activist was to go meet a politician and pretend we had a movement, and say on debt cancellation. There was the beginnings of one, but it wasn't the kind that could sway Vice President Gore or President Clinton when I went to see them. They were swayed by the reason of the argument, and that's why they got onto debt cancellation, which was hugely appreciative, and I should have said that at the start, your leadership there. But growing the social movement, for instance, in the United Kingdom, in the last election, polling 4th and 5th, or was it 5th and 6th, uppermost on the mind of the British electorate was global health and poverty. This is very inspiring to me. This makes Great Britain great to me, and it is why Tony Blair could and Gordon Brown can take leadership on this. We don't have that in the United States. If you took a poll, what was uppermost on the... Now it's getting there. Mm-hmm. But it's not getting in the top 20. Right. It's 21, 22. These candidates, all of which I have met with, and are now going around wearing these white bracelets and starting to talk about our issues. This is the beginning of it. But the reason we could do that is we could organize, field organizers in all the primary states. People here, quiet geniuses like John Doerr, I don't know if he's here, who who support me, or Bill Gates who supports me, or the Buffetts who support. They're paying for this. I couldn't pay for this. We actually have to get organised. You get serious. In France, in Italy, in Germany, the last time we had 2 people in an office worked with the local German NGO, Deine Stimme gegen Armut. And Germany, who doesn't have any interests really in Africa historically as a colonizer, starting to get interested in this. And the German people care about Europe. Africa's our next door neighbour. So it's starting to wake up, and I do sense that there is a movement stirring, and I'm excited, but it's not there yet. And while it's not there yet, I have to come and arm wrestle and bore the arse off the likes of you sometimes. But you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Let me just ask, because we're out of time. I want you. Could you give a wrap up? And Bono, you give a wrap up.
Okay, I just want to point out that there is also the beginning of a broad movement on the climate crisis. And if you count up the number of grassroots organizations that have sprung up spontaneously around the world to try to organize a solution to the climate crisis, it is now, by some counts, in the hundreds of thousands. In the movie that I made, part of it says there are only 2 wealthy countries that are not part of the global agreement at Kyoto, the United States and Australia. That's now out of date. Over the last 3 years, I personally trained 300 people, sports stars, celebrities, Kate Blanchett, God bless her, sheep farmers, others, all across Australia. They have now given my slideshow in their own voices, with their own life experiences in every town in Australia. When the election took place a couple of months ago, John Howard, presiding over 10 straight years of economic growth, seen as successful in dealing with terrorism, was overwhelmingly defeated, and the number one issue was the climate crisis. And I had the privilege of standing by Kevin Rudd's side as he, in a press conference before the election, said that if he was elected, his number one his first act in office would be to change Australia's position. And he did so, and then he went to Bali. And we celebrated together in Bali that now there is only one country that has not, in the developed world, that it has not joined. This grassroots movement is growing. And I want to say to everyone who is a part of it, who wants to solve the climate crisis, we have to take Bono's agenda on extreme poverty and fighting disease and dealing with the HIV/AIDS crisis and make it an integral part of the world's effort to solve the climate crisis. And to people in my country, the United States of America, when we launched the Marshall Plan, it was not only self-interest, it was also because we see ourselves as a moral country. And an agenda for solving these two crises that has that moral component has a much greater chance of success. That's why the evangelical movement is beginning to awaken very powerfully to say we have to help these people in the rest of the world. And in doing so, we also help ourselves. Whatsoever you do unto the least of these, you do unto me, is a core teaching in my religious tradition. And it does have a part in foreign policy because it is now meeting the mandate for the survival of human civilization. It is very hard to realize and imagine that that is now what is at stake. But that is precisely what is at stake, and we do not have much time. So building this baseload movement, building a mass movement at the grassroots level that addresses these agendas effectively, puts a price on carbon, includes a large adaptation fund, and helps the world get ready to solve the climate crisis. That's the order of business that we ought to be focused on.
Terrific. Thank you.
Great.
Bono, a last word from you.
Well, just on the issue of justice rather than charity, it is clear that the people who have least created this climate crisis that Al Gore speaks so eloquently of are the least equipped to prepare for it. And I think that it is a great injustice if we create a problem of this magnitude and don't meet the scale of the emergency with the proper scale of response. I think that would be a crushing blow to our value system. But it is justice, not charity, that we have always argued. I think that adaptation funds will have to answer that early question, what are the practical things? I think there will have to be an adaptation fund, that's clear. In that adaptation fund, adaptation is where social protection programs for farmers on parched lands, preparation for floods in low-lying areas. But actually, schools, education is the best chance we have at reducing overpopulation in the world, which we have not talked about and is looming on that. It turns out it's counterintuitive, but actually the only known way to reduce population in the developing world is to give people a chance at a real life and a glance at prosperity, and therefore they have putting girls in school. They have smaller families, and that's a proven fact. I won't get into it now, but that's going to have to happen. Mitigation is something this man knows about. I'm not an expert in. Overall, I want to say, calling it my agenda is, and I know why you're being so generous, but in truth, my agenda is our agenda. The people have all worked at this longer than I have, and I'm sure harder than I have, though I work pretty hard at this. But, African leaders like Nkonjo Iweala, Ngozi Nkonjo-Iweala was a hero of mine. He was finance minister in Nigeria, and the corruption cop, they called her. People like Wangari Maathai that you spoke of. This is their agenda. Desmond Tutu, who's the greatest man on earth. And then, development economists, Jeff Sachs, Kevin Watkins, it goes on and on. It's their agenda. And I think I'm ready to learn more from the professor. I'll stay student. And we will cautiously approach this extremely delicate situation. But we need to know what the solutions are. We're learning what they are. We're going to go over and see Google in a minute. I'm very curious about that. Larry and Sergey got married and they had a child, Mark Zuckerberg. He formed Facebook. But we're learning about this, and because we do not want to lead our people a dance. We've led them a little bit of a dance. We're not providing the level already with our own issues, let alone getting involved in climate crisis. And then just to Davos itself, which very generously looked after me on it, and our people over the years. And I called last year. I said, it's the icing on capitalism's cake. But it has to be said that there's creative energy in the corporate world that needs to be unlocked. And I long since grew out of the idea, artist good, businessman bad. I got over that when I was like 22. And there is extraordinary creative energy around here. And with RED, we launched it here. We used some of that corporate energy. We got $54 million. Bobby Shriver is sitting there. He's my partner on RED. This is amazing. $54 million in the first year. It'll be $100 million next year for AIDS drugs. So something does come out of these talking shops. And maybe next year or the year after we come back, maybe this great man and myself can actually show some concrete results from this discussion. And that would be my
terrific. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Bono and Al Gore.